I had just gotten home after one of those grueling days that left every inch of me screaming for a break. I kicked off my shoes at the door, tossed my keys carelessly onto the table, and headed straight for the couch, mentally preparing to drown out the day's stress with a bit of mindless TV and maybe some half-hearted attempts at relaxation. It was around 2 a.m., a time when the world outside should be silent and calm. But tonight, silence wasn't on the agenda. No sooner had I sunk into the couch than an unnerving sound shattered the peace. A heavy, relentless pounding on my door. It wasn't the polite, measured knock of a neighbor or a friend. It was aggressive, as if someone was trying to force their way in. My heart skipped a beat. I sat frozen, staring at the door, my mind racing through a series of impossible scenarios. Who would be out here at this ungodly hour? And why would they be so intent on breaking down my door? I tried to steady my breathing, but each thump against the door sent fresh pulses of adrenaline coursing through me. For a split second, I wondered if this was some kind of prank or a warped joke meant to disturb my quiet night. But deep down, the sound was too raw, too desperate. There was an urgency in those strikes that hinted at something far more sinister than mere mischief. I moved slowly toward the door, every step measured and cautious. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon or a means of escape if things turned ugly. My hand brushed against my phone in the drawer as the urge to call the police battled with an odd compulsion to find out what was going on for myself. The pounding escalated, each blow sounding more frantic than the last, and I realized with a jolt that this was no ordinary late-night interruption. Peering through the peephole, I was met with nothing but a sliver of dim streetlight and the dark void of the night beyond. I couldn't make out any features or details, a faceless urgency that left me with more questions than answers. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt back into the safety of my room. Yet there was also a nagging need to know if someone was in real danger or if I was witnessing something far more bizarre. I took a deep breath, trying to find the balance between rational thought and raw, gut-wrenching fear. My mind raced through possibilities. A desperate person in need of help, a lost soul trying to force entry, or something else entirely that I couldn't yet fathom. In that split second, the door in front of me seemed to morph from a simple barrier into a portal, one that could lead to salvation or danger beyond my wildest nightmares. Every fiber of my being was on high alert. I considered calling out to whoever was on the other side, my voice trembling as I weighed the risk of drawing them closer versus the risk of leaving them in a state of desperation. I recalled countless warnings about answering doors in the middle of the night, especially when the knock wasn't a polite inquiry, but a violent insistence. The thought of being alone and vulnerable in my own apartment suddenly felt more terrifying than any potential confrontation with an angry intruder. In that moment, as the pounding continued without pause, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger than a simple disturbance. My mind began to conjure up images of dangerous scenarios, a desperate fugitive seeking refuge, an intruder with sinister intentions, or perhaps even something supernatural that defied logic. The pounding was no longer just a sound. It was a signal that something had disrupted the normal flow of my life. Standing there, heart hammering and senses razor sharp, I felt an inexplicable pull to act. I edged closer to the door, my hand hovering over the knob, ready to either open it and confront the unknown or retreat and secure myself within the safe confines of my living room. The sound from the other side grew louder, more insistent, as if it was urging me to make a decision, one that would forever alter the course of my night, and perhaps my life. I couldn't help but wonder if fate had a twisted sense of humor. Just when I thought I'd finally escaped the relentless grind of everyday challenges, here I was, face to face with a mystery that defied explanation. Each explosive beat on my door echoed the chaos that had been simmering just beneath the surface of my otherwise routine existence. It was as if the universe had decided that I was overdue for a jolt. A reminder that nothing, not even a mundane night at home, is ever truly safe from the unexpected. In that tense, breathless moment, I made the decision to face whatever lay beyond the door. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure the intruder might hear it over the cacophony of their own desperate knocking. I reached out, fingers trembling, and gripped the cold metal of the door handle. A final, deep breath filled my lungs as I prepared to step into the unknown, fully aware that this moment might be the turning point of everything I thought I knew about safety, routine, and the unpredictable twists that life so often throws at you. That's where I stood, caught in the crosshairs of fear and curiosity, with nothing but the pounding on the other side to challenge the quiet of my night. I had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. My life was about to change in ways I could never have predicted. I cracked open the door a fraction more, still holding onto the lingering dread from that relentless pounding. Standing there in the dim hallway light was a tall man whose disheveled blonde hair and rumpled, unbuttoned shirt told me he hadn't had the luxury of a proper night's sleep. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, met mine with an intensity that made me instinctively take a step back. "I'm Zach," he managed to say, his voice rough around the edges. His gaze flickered over me like he was expecting something entirely different. Then, almost in disbelief, he exhaled a shaky, "Oh hell, you're real." The words hung in the air, charged with a mix of relief and something else, an urgency I couldn't quite decipher. I couldn't help but feel that something was off. Here I was, trying to shake off the remnants of a tiresome day, and now I was confronted by a stranger who seemed caught between panic and wonder. My mind raced. Who exactly was this man, and what had driven him to my doorstep at 2 a.m.? I couldn't let him in without knowing more, yet the desperate look in his eyes urged me to listen. "Zach, what are you doing here at this hour?" I asked, my voice betraying more concern than I intended. I was scanning his face, trying to pinpoint any sign of deceit or danger. His eyes darted around, as if expecting something or someone to burst through the shadows at any moment. He hesitated, then stepped a little closer, as if to convince me that he wasn't a threat. I'm not sure how to explain it all," he began, his tone wavering. "I was out, chasing someone or maybe running from someone. I don't know. It's all a bit of a blur right now." His words tumbled out in fragments, each sentence laden with urgency and fear. The disarray of his appearance wasn't just about a bad night's sleep. It was as if he'd been living through something chaotic, something far beyond a normal midnight stroll. I felt my pulse quicken. There was a raw, unfiltered desperation in his voice that tugged at something deep inside me, a mix of curiosity and a sense of responsibility. But caution nagged at the back of my mind. It was one thing to encounter a lost soul in need of help, but another entirely to open my door to a stranger whose story was as tangled as the dark night outside. "Look," I said slowly, "I want to help if I can, but I need to know what's going on. Who are you chasing? Or what exactly are you running from?" My words came out more forcefully than I intended, a mixture of genuine concern and the instinctual need to protect my own space. Zach's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place: regret, fear, and a touch of something else that bordered on resignation. "There isn't time to get into all of it," he replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But trust me when I say that what's out there, it's not what you think. You need to be careful. Things aren't as they seem tonight." The weight of his words pressed down on me, and for a moment, I wondered if I was stepping into a trap. My instincts were screaming that this situation was spiraling into something dangerous, yet his earnestness made it hard to dismiss him outright. There was a haunted quality in his eyes, like he'd seen horrors that defied explanation. And then there was that curious remark earlier, "Oh, hell, you're real," as if he had been expecting a myth rather than a flesh-and-blood person. I stood there in the doorway, torn between the impulse to slam it shut and the compulsion to hear him out. The night was thick with tension, and every creak of the old building seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just a chance encounter. It felt like I had been pulled into a narrative far larger than a simple act of midnight desperation. Zach took a tentative step forward, and in that split second I caught a glimpse of something unusual. Beneath the layers of fatigue and urgency, there was a spark, a glimmer of truth that hinted at a story riddled with twists I wasn't ready to comprehend. "You're not going to believe this, but I've been following a lead," he murmured, glancing around as if expecting invisible eyes to be watching us. "I thought I'd heard about you, about someone who could help. I didn't expect to find you not like this, at least." My mind spun with questions. How did he know about me? Was I really that significant? Or was he grasping at straws in a desperate bid for salvation? The stranger's fragmented narrative only deepened the mystery. Every word he uttered seemed to peel back a layer of the mundane world I thought I knew, revealing a hidden tapestry of secrets and dangers lurking just beneath the surface. I felt an odd mix of skepticism and reluctant empathy. Here was a man who had clearly been through hell, seeking something or someone he believed could offer rescue or redemption. And while every rational fiber urged me to be wary, there was an undeniable pull, a sense that by stepping into his story, I might find answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. "All right, Zach," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell me what you need. I'm listening." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a decision that could alter the course of my night, perhaps even my life. The uncertainty of his story, the raw fear in his tone, and that strange mix of vulnerability and urgency left me no choice but to lean in, despite the gnawing suspicion that this was only the beginning of a much deeper, more twisted tale. As I stood there, caught between the comfort of my familiar solitude and the beckoning chaos of the unknown, I realized that sometimes, in the dead of night, fate doesn't knock politely. It barges in, uninvited and irrevocable, challenging everything you thought you knew about safety, trust, and the very fabric of reality. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on me as I stood there, heart still racing from the earlier confrontation. Zach's eyes, which had flickered with a mix of fear and something else I couldn't quite name, hardened as he took a hesitant step back. "There's something I need to confess," he said, his voice low and uncertain. I've been dating Bethany for 10 months. I froze, the words hanging in the air like a grotesque parody of a confession. Bethany, my Bethany, the woman I'd shared years of my life with, the person I trusted more than anyone else, was the same woman who had been entangled with this stranger? My mind reeled, desperately trying to reconcile the gentle, loving face I had known with the image of betrayal that now burned in my thoughts. He continued, his tone a tortured whisper. "She told me she was lonely, that she was just going through a rough patch after breaking up with her obsessed ex. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that she was hurting and needed someone to lean on." His words tumbled out, half apologetic, half confused, as if he himself was struggling to understand how deep the deception ran. Without another word, Zach pulled out his phone. With trembling fingers, he navigated to a folder overflowing with evidence, a barrage of hundreds of messages, photos, and videos. I stared at the screen, each piece of digital communication a cruel reminder of the intimacy that had been secreted away from me. My eyes lingered on one message in particular, the timestamp nearly mocking me. It read, "Can't make it today. He came home early, sent just 3 hours ago." At that moment, something inside me shattered completely. The last message wasn't just a note in a string of texts. It was a declaration, a final piece of undeniable evidence that confirmed what I had feared all along. Every flicker of happiness, every shared smile, every promise whispered in the dark now burned into my memory as a lie. Rage surged through me, hot and violent, as if every ounce of trust, every tender hope I'd clung to was being ripped away. My thoughts became a cacophony of betrayal and disbelief. How could the woman I loved, my partner, my confidant, have led such a double life. The intimate conversations, the plans we made together, every shared secret now felt like a carefully constructed illusion. I felt both exposed and utterly violated, as if the core of who I was had been desecrated by someone I once held dear. I looked up at Zach, my vision blurred by the sting of tears and the burn of fury. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice thick with emotion. "Why would she do this? How could she? How could you?" The words tumbled out in a frantic rush, each syllable laced with an intensity one hadn't known existed within me. Zach's face contorted with regret and pain, his eyes pleading for some sort of understanding even as they mirrored the gravity of his own remorse. "I never wanted to hurt you," he murmured, the admission sounding hollow against the tidal wave of my emotions. I thought I was helping her." She said she was in pain, that she felt trapped by her past, by someone who wouldn't let her be. I never imagined any of this would lead to this. The sound of his words, meant perhaps to comfort or to explain, only deepened the wound. Every message, every shared photo, every recorded moment on that screen was a betrayal I could no longer ignore. The evidence was irrefutable, a digital record of a love affair that had flourished in the shadows of my own life. The final message, with its damning brevity, was like a silent scream that confirmed the worst. The man I thought I knew was nothing more than a charade, a series of carefully hidden moments that now unraveled in my mind. Anger pulsed through me, a raw, burning need for retribution. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the sheer audacity of the deception, the meticulous way in which every lie had been layered upon the last until my reality felt nothing like what I had believed it to be. The door, once a threshold to comfort and safety, now loomed as the gateway to a nightmare I never imagined I'd have to face. My hands clenched in a fist at my sides, the physical manifestation of a fury that I struggled to contain. Every instinct screamed at me to lash out, to tear into this man for his part in this treachery, and even more so, to confront the woman who had stolen my trust. But as I stood there, the evidence burning itself into my memory, a crushing realization set in. Nothing would ever be the same again. The life I'd known, the trust I'd placed in love, had been reduced to ashes. I felt a cold detachment creeping in, a numbness that threatened to swallow me whole as the full weight of the betrayal took hold. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one a dagger twisting deeper. How long had this been going on? What else had she hidden? And perhaps most painfully of all, what did I do to deserve such treachery? In the silence that followed, the room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the residue of shattered dreams and broken promises. I knew then that I stood at a crossroads, facing a future tainted by deceit and the bitter taste of betrayal. The path ahead was uncertain, lined with questions that no amount of evidence could answer. All I knew was that my heart, once so full of trust and love, had been betrayed in the worst possible way, and that this night, with its confessions and its painful revelations, marked the irrevocable end of the life I once thought I knew. I was still reeling from the storm of confessions and revelations when I heard the soft sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. The air, already heavy with betrayal and raw emotion, seemed to pause as if bracing itself for what was coming next. I barely had time to collect my scattered thoughts before Bethany appeared at the top of the stairs, and in that moment, everything shifted. There she was, Bethany, calm and composed, as if the chaos that had just shattered my world was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her evening. What made the scene almost surreal was that she was wearing one of my own t-shirts, the one I had once given her with all the hope and trust of our better days. Seeing that shirt draped over her slender frame, so casually and without even a flicker of remorse in her eyes, felt like a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. She moved slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried, as though the weight of the night's revelations were a trivial inconvenience rather than the seismic betrayal they truly were. When she reached the landing, she paused for a heartbeat, surveyed the room with a bored detachment, and then remarked in a tone that was equal parts mocking and dismissive, "Well, this is a real circus." Her words, uttered with an almost imperceptible shrug of indifference, cut through the tension like a cold blade. I could see the shock ripple across Zach's face. He had been bracing himself for an explanation, for some hint of regret or a desperate attempt at damage control. Instead, he was met with her unflinching, impassive expression. There was no remorse, no trembling vulnerability, nothing that suggested she even cared about the devastation her actions had wrought. In that charged silence, I realized something that struck me like a physical blow. This was Bethany's real face. The tender, caring person I had clung to in my darkest hours was nothing more than a master of deception, effortlessly compartmentalizing her guilt and emotions. Her calm demeanor, the lack of any visible distress, and even the casual choice of attire, the shirt that once symbolized our shared memories, revealed a truth that no amount of digital evidence or frantic confession could ever hide. My throat tightened as I tried to find my voice amid the pounding of my heart. I wanted to demand answers, to confront her with all the pain and betrayal that churned inside me. But the words simply wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there paralyzed, absorbing the reality of her indifference. The very air in the room seemed to conspire with her nonchalance, making it clear that nothing she did or said would ever bridge the chasm of betrayal that now separated us. I watched her carefully, every gesture and subtle expression etched into my memory. There was a bored resignation in the slight arch of her brow, a dispassionate acceptance that this circus was nothing more than an inconvenience, a disruption to be shrugged off until it was over. I felt a surge of anger, yes, but beneath it lay a profound sadness. I had never truly known the real her. The person I thought I loved had been a beautifully crafted illusion, her true self masked by an effortless facade of detachment and indifference. Zach's eyes, still wide with disbelief, flickered between the two of us, as if searching for some reconciliation between the man who had spilled the secrets of our shared betrayal and the woman who now embodied it. But there was no reconciliation to be found. His shock mirrored my own inner tumult, a shared realization that nothing would ever be the same. Bethany's calm, almost bored reaction told me that every carefully spun lie, every act of betrayal, was part of who she was. There was no desperate plea for forgiveness, no tearful confession or attempt at justification. Instead, there was only the cool, unyielding truth. In that moment, as I struggled to process the unrelenting cascade of shattered trust, I understood that I had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy. The passion, the promises, the intimacy we had once shared were now tainted by the stark reality of her true nature. The evidence was not only in the messages, the photos, the videos. It was in the very way she carried herself. Every step she took down those stairs was a silent testimony to the person I thought I knew, now revealed in the harsh light of betrayal. I felt as though I were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape, a place where love had been reduced to a hollow performance and trust was nothing more than a distant memory. And as I looked at Bethany, I knew with a final, crushing clarity that the person I had loved was gone forever. The warmth and vulnerability that had once defined our connection had been replaced by an icy, remorseless detachment. In that moment, I was forced to confront the unbearable truth. Sometimes, the biggest lies are not the ones shouted in anger or whispered in secret, but those that are lived with a quiet, almost serene composure. Bethany's real face had been there all along, hidden behind a mask that I had so desperately wished was real. And now, standing in the wreckage of our shattered past, I was left with nothing but the bitter knowledge that I had been deceived by someone who never truly cared, someone who saw our shared memories as nothing more than props in the grand performance of her life. As the silence settled over the room, I realized that everything I had believed in, the love, the trust, the future, was nothing more than a beautifully orchestrated illusion. And with that realization, the final curtain fell on the life I had once thought I knew. I looked squarely at Zach, my voice calm, but slicing through the tension like a sharpened blade. "Zach, there's something you need to know," I said, each word measured and deliberate. "Bethany and I are married." The air in the room seemed to still for a heartbeat. I watched as the color drained from his face, his confident facade crumbling into a look of shock and disbelief. His eyes went wide, and in that moment, I knew he realized the extent of how he'd been played. A mere pawn in a game he never saw coming. Without missing a beat, I reached for the bottle on the shelf. It was a rare, expensive whiskey, worth $400, a symbol of everything I had invested in trust and everything that was now shattering around me. I uncorked it with an almost casual precision and poured a measure into a crystal glass. The amber liquid caught the light, glistening like a promise of retribution. "Care for a drink, Zach?" I offered, my tone laced with an unsettling calm. "Let's compare the facts." The invitation hung in the air, a challenge as much as it was a statement. It wasn't merely about the whiskey. It was about confronting the tangled web of lies with undeniable, bitter truths. At that moment, I saw a crack in Bethany's veneer. For the first time all night, the mask she'd worn so effortlessly began to crumble. The expression on her face shifted from bored indifference to frantic panic. Her eyes darted around, her fingers fidgeted at her side, and a hint of fear crept into her tone, an emotion I hadn't seen from her before. It was as if the cool detachment she had maintained up until now was falling apart under the weight of the revelation. I could see the realization dawning on Zach in stark detail. The shock in his eyes was undeniable. He had been used all along, his actions based on a lie that had now been exposed. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to take the glass I offered. The whiskey, expensive and potent, seemed to mirror the gravity of the situation, each drop a reminder that nothing in this room was as it had appeared. As I sat there, the room charged with the electricity of exposed truths, every detail became a statement. The smooth clink of ice against glass punctuated the silence. The glint of the whiskey in the dim light was a silent verdict, and Bethany's unraveling mask painted the picture of a life steeped in deception. I kept my voice even as I continued. "You see, Zach, the facts are clear. You thought you were part of something clandestine, something secret, but you were just an accessory in a bigger lie." My words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of betrayal and the cold, calculated resolve of someone who had been wronged deeply. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each of us caught in our roles, the deceiver, the deceived, and the one who had been left to pick up the shattered pieces of trust. In that charged moment, every second stretched out, the silence around us filled only by the soft clatter of glass and the stifled sound of Bethany's rising panic. Zach's eyes flickered with a mix of regret and disbelief as he slowly lifted the glass to his lips. I watched every reaction, noting how the mask he had donned for so long of his own accord now faltered, the realization of his part in this dark farce too much to bear. And all the while, Bethany's composed facade, which had been her armor all night, was now breaking down, revealing a glimpse of vulnerability and desperation that she had desperately tried to hide. In that charged moment of confrontation, as the expensive whiskey flowed between us and the truth lay bare, I knew that the game had irrevocably changed. The facts were no longer negotiable, and every lie, every carefully concealed secret, was now subject to the harsh light of reality. With every sip and every silent glance exchanged, the night deepened into a reckoning where every truth had its day, and every deceit was left to face the consequences. The finality of the night had become undeniable. a darkness that no longer held the promise of secrets or hidden truths, but only the stark, unyielding collapse of everything Bethany once believed she controlled. I stood there, every calculated action of the past few hours culminating in this moment of icy resolve. Every asset, every tangible reminder of our shared life. The house, the money, the car, even the bills that had once been a testament to our future, had been mine all along. They were symbols of a trust one had once placed in her, now reduced to meaningless property in the wake of betrayal. Slowly, deliberately, I walked over to the small desk in the corner of our living room, where the devices of our domestic life were neatly arranged like pieces in a puzzle. With deliberate precision, I gathered the files, the account statements, and every document that testified to the life she had been weaving in secret. This was her last hope, a fragile illusion of security that now lay crumbling at my feet. Every envelope, every faded receipt was a reminder that nothing here was truly hers to keep. With a measured breath, I reached for my phone. My fingers, steady and cold, dialed the bank's secure number without a hint of hesitation. "Block the credit card," I said, my tone flat and devoid of any lingering emotion, "for $20,000. In that brief, transactional moment, the last vestige of her financial independence evaporated. The confirmation beeped through the line, a digital death knell for her misguided sense of entitlement. In one swift stroke, I had dismantled her lifeline. Before I could fully savor the calculated retribution, a knock echoed through the silence, a final, fateful intrusion. I opened the door to reveal Rachel standing on the doorstep, her eyes hardened by years of disillusionment. At 42, she bore the weight of countless disappointments, and tonight was no exception. Her expression was void of the sisterly warmth that one might have hoped for. Instead, it was marked by an unyielding resolve to sever all ties with the person who had once been her family. "I've seen everything," Rachel stated flatly, her voice carrying a tone of irrevocable finality. "I want nothing more to do with her." The words were not a question or an invitation for discussion. They were a decree. It was clear that she had pieced together the damning evidence long before I had confronted Bethany. In her eyes, the cascade of lies had already doomed her sister, and any remnants of familial affection had dissolved into bitter resignation. The impact of her arrival was almost poetic. Here was the final piece of the puzzle. Not only had Bethany deceived me, her husband and the man who had put his trust in her, but she had also lost the one person who might have offered her solace in the darkest moments of her life. In that instant, I saw the complete annihilation of her world. Her lover, the man who had been complicit in her web of deceit, now stood revealed as nothing more than a misguided pawn. And now, with Rachel's appearance, even the semblance of family had been stripped away. Inside, I heard Bethany's voice, a soft, tremulous sound that broke through the heavy silence of our living room. "Alex, please," she pleaded, her tone raw with a sudden, desperate vulnerability. It was the first time I had heard her truly falter, a crack in the cool, composed mask she had maintained all night. But there was nothing left to salvage. I met her gaze with a steely calm that left no room for negotiation. "There is nothing left, Bethany," I said evenly, the finality of my words hanging between us like a verdict. "Everything, the house, the money, the car, the bills, they were never yours to command. They belong to me. And now, your credit is blocked. You have no way to reach out or rebuild what you've lost." Her face, once the carefully constructed mask of indifference, contorted into an expression of shock and despair. The realization of her total isolation struck her like a blow. In that moment, as the full weight of her decisions bore down upon her, I could see the facade she had so meticulously built shatter before my eyes. The woman who had once manipulated our shared life with cold detachment was now reduced to a trembling shadow of regret. Rachel's gaze never wavered as she absorbed the scene. "I told you, Bethany," she said quietly, the disappointment in her voice unmistakable. I warned you that this was a line you shouldn't cross. Now, I have nothing left to offer you." Her words were as final as the locked credit line on her account, sealing her sister's fate beyond any hope of redemption. In that silent, devastating moment, everything came crashing down. Bethany had lost everything: her husband, her lover, her family. The empire she had built on lies and half-truths had collapsed into dust. There was no salvageable shard of her former life, no lingering thread of the person I once believed I knew. The betrayal, the calculated deceit, and the cold remorselessness of her actions had exacted a toll from which there was no return. As I stood there, watching the last of her illusions disintegrate into nothingness, I felt a bittersweet clarity settle over me. This was not a victory born of cruelty, but a necessary reckoning, a purging of the toxicity that had once threatened to consume everything I held dear. The truth, in its unvarnished form, had the power to destroy, and tonight had destroyed everything she had built. I took a final look around the room, a room that had once been a sanctuary of shared dreams and whispered promises, and acknowledged that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of betrayal, loss, and the shattering of trust pressed down upon us like the final, crushing act of a tragedy with no heroes and no happy endings. In the silent aftermath, I realized that sometimes, to truly start over, one must first allow everything false to crumble into oblivion. There was no coming back from this. The collapse of Bethany's world was complete, and in its place, there was nothing but the cold, unyielding truth of a life lived without honor, loyalty, or love. As I closed the door behind Rachel and turned back to the shattered remnants of our shared past, I knew that I had reclaimed not just what was rightfully mine, but the clarity that comes only with the finality of truth. And with that, I whispered into the dark silence, "Goodbye, Bethany." Hours after the crushing finality of that night, when I had thought the chapter was permanently closed, there was an unexpected knock at my door. I had barely settled into the uneasy silence of my reclaimed solitude when I found myself facing a familiar, yet now utterly foreign, figure. There she was, Bethany, standing hesitantly on my doorstep, her eyes downcast and her voice reduced to a desperate whisper. "Please, I have nowhere to go," she pleaded, as if the shattered remnants of our past could somehow be salvaged by a single night's shelter. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words and the bitter residue of betrayal. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman I had once loved, but the raw, exposed truth of someone who had manipulated her way through our lives with chilling ease. The vulnerability in her eyes did nothing to thaw the cold resolve that had taken root in me. Without a flicker of hesitation or any further word, I simply closed the door in her face. The sound of the latch clicking shut was final, a punctuation mark on a life built on lies. There was no need for further explanation. In that brief, heart-wrenching moment, she stood alone on the other side of the door, a solitary figure in the cold night, her hopes and deceptions left behind in the threshold of what used to be our home. In the weeks and months that followed, life carried on with an unexpected clarity. I moved forward, piece by piece, reclaiming the fragments of a life that had been defined by deceit. And then, one day, I caught wind of the latest news, a final chapter in the tragic story that had once so painfully intertwined our lives. Bethany was no longer the woman who had once commanded our shared space. Instead, she was now a ghost of her former self, wandering from one stranger's couch to another, her world reduced to the barest remnants of what she had so carefully built. Every detail of the report was like a cold balm on the fresh wounds of betrayal. She had lost everything: her home, her money, her car, the bills, and most of all, the life she had manipulated with such ease. It was as if every facade, every carefully maintained lie, had finally crumbled into oblivion. And there I was on the other side of it all, feeling nothing but relief. Relief that I no longer had to live under the weight of betrayal and the constant gnawing of deception. Relief that the person I had once trusted had been stripped of every pretense, left naked in the harsh light of her own making. There was no lingering bitterness, no festering regret, only the profound peace of a burden finally lifted. In reclaiming my life piece by piece, I had found clarity and strength in the aftermath of chaos. As I sit here now, in the calm of my newfound solitude, I reflect on the stark transformation of everything that was once so painfully familiar. The betrayal had cut deep, and the scars ran deep. Yet with every passing day, the relief grows, an ever-present reminder that truth, however harsh, can pave the way to a future unburdened by the ghosts of the past. And in that relief, I finally feel free.